the name game in Megillas Rus. The story of the Book of Ruth starts with a character who's called Elimelech, and he is in a position of authority in Israel, and he goes at a time of a famine to go and live in the land of Moab with his wife and his 2 sons. His 2 sons married 2 Moabite women. The sons and Elimelech die, and Naomi is a widow, and she goes back to the land of Israel, and originally both her daughter-in-laws want to accompany her, and Ruth famously, Orpah leaves, and Ruth, her second daughter-in-law, famously says, where you go, I will go, your people will be my people, and she goes back with her mother-in-law to the land of Israel. And there, Ruth goes to glean in the field of Boaz under the instructions of Naomi, and the reason why Naomi tells her to go there is because Boaz is a relative of Elimelech, his brother most probably, according to Midrash, and therefore Ruth thinks that that she should glean in Boaz's field so that she should get herself known there and eventually perhaps come to marry Boaz. So she goes in the field and Boaz sees her and he says, listen, I can't marry you because there's somebody else who comes before me, and that we'll talk about that person a little bit later. The most interesting thing is that the character, but Ruth has a son with Boaz, and his name is Obed, and then Boaz dies. Now the most interesting thing is that the Midrash tells us that Boaz's name was in fact Ivsan, that he was in fact one of the Shoftim. So the question is, why is Boaz called Boaz in the book of Ruth? And for that, the Sfas Emes tells us because his name is a contraction of 2 words, Bo-az. The strength is within him. Hashem oz le'amo yotein. The strength is within him. Why did Boaz need strength? Do you know why? Because a lot of people did not want to marry Moabites, because there's a pasuk in the Torah in Parshas Kisese which says, Lo yovo Ammoni u'Moavi bikal Hashem. A Moabite and an Ammonite are not allowed to enter the congregation of Hashem. Now this doesn't mean they can't become Jewish, it just means they can't marry someone Jewish. But the rabbis at the time of the story of Ruth taught us, they expounded this to understand to mean that this only applied to the men and not the women. So the Gemara in Yevamos 76b tells us, Ammoni velo Ammonis, Moavi velo Moavis. The problem is, at the time when the law was being interpreted and the halacha was being determined by the rabbis, a lot of people weren't keen to follow it. They didn't want to be the first. Boaz said, I don't mind, I'll marry Ruth, I've got the strength of conviction. He was one of the Shoftim, he was one of the people determining the law, and he said, I am willing to teach and to practice what I preach, and I'm willing to marry myself a Moabite woman. Let's look at the story and look at other people's names and how significant names are in the story. So let's start off with the first pasuk in chapter 1 verse 1. Vayelech ish mibeis Levi. Vayelech ish mibeis Lechem Yehuda lagur b'sdei Moab hu ve'ishto u'shtei vanov. And a man unnamed goes from Beis Lechem, Bethlehem, and he goes and lives in the fields of Moab. Look at the irony in the pasuk. There's a philosophy professor in Bar-Ilan University called Raphael Shochat, and he says, how ironic. Beis Lechem is translated as base, bias, lechem, bread. He leaves the house of bread and goes to Moab, the place which we're told don't go anywhere near the Moabites. A Moabite can't enter the congregation of Hashem. They were cruel to you. And he says, and he goes to not only Moab, but stay Moab, a field of Moab. What does a field represent? Open, unsafe, unprotected. So he leaves the safety and security of the house of bread at a time of famine and goes to the fields of Moab. And it doesn't say the names of anyone in that first pasuk. It says him, his wife, and his 2 sons. No names. Names are used as a literary device, and they've got a very deeper meaning, as we will see in verse 2. Next pasuk. V'shem ha'ish Elimelech, and the name of the man was Elimelech. And the Midrash tells us his name was Elimelech, and it's also a contraction. Eli tovo malchus. He was from the tribe of Judah, the princely tribe, the royal tribe, and he thought to himself, I am a member of the aristocracy, no one can touch me. And therefore he thought, there's a famine, I've got money, I'm all right, Jack. And he went off to Moab with his family, but it didn't quite work out how he planned. His wife was called Naomi because from the word Na'im, Ne'imah, her deeds were pleasant. And their two sons were called Machlon and Chilion. Those names are the most awful, comes from the word destruction, decimation, erase their names, because those two married Moabite women and they died without children. Their sort of like their story ended there. Those are not the nicest names, and the Midrash in fact tells us that their real names were probably Yoash and Sarah from Divrei Hayomim. But those names are not so nice either. So we can see clearly that names are quite important. There's an overarching theme in the book, and that is the idea of perpetuating the name of the dead, because Ruth is supposed to marry the nearest kinsman in a form of levirate marriage, and she goes to find someone who's closely related to her, and Naomi assumed that would be Boaz, but we see there's a person who might be closer in the story. And in Hebrew, we say that phrase to perpetuate the name of the dead, Lahokim Shem Hames, so that the widow would have children with this with a new member of the family and be able to bring up the name of the dead husband. The person who was the closest relative to Elimelech and Machlon and Chilion was a man who is called in the book of Ruth, he's called Ploni Almoni. Now, Ploni Almoni can mean lots of different things. Most probably his name was not like that. It could be so-and-so, which has got negative connotations in English. It could be Mr. Anonymous, so he hid his identity because he didn't step up. He wasn't willing to marry Ruth. Or we could say that the word almon comes from a widow. Either he was fit for a widow, or he himself was widowed from the words of the Torah because he wasn't willing to step up and keep the latest rabbinic ruling from the rabbis. And so there's lots of ideas why his name's Ploni Almoni, and his real name, according to Midrash, is Tov, and he was Elimelech's brother. And he did not want to marry Ruth for a variety of reasons, either because he didn't want to lose his family holdings, or he wasn't willing, like Boaz, who stood up and was strong, and he said, I'm willing to stand up for the words of the rabbis. And this Tov, just maybe his name gets blotted out because he didn't do it, and he wasn't willing to marry Ruth and to do the mitzvah of the levirate marriage and lahokim shem hames, to perpetuate the name of his dead relative. So we see in the book of Ruth there are loads of names and loads of symbols. We spoke about Boaz, that his strength was within him. He had the strength of character to go and marry Ruth, even though it was just a newly established law where other people didn't want to do it. There's Oved, the son of Boaz and Ruth. His name was Oved. It's like Eved Hashem. We spoke about Beit Lechem. We speak about the house of bread and the fields of Moab, the security of the house of bread. Elimelech, who said to himself, Eli Tovo Malchus, I'm all right, Jack, I'm royalty, I'm aristocracy, but it didn't quite work out like that. His wife, Naomi, who she was very pleasant. Later on, when she gets back to Israel, into the land of Israel, people say, hey, that's Naomi. And she says, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara. I'm bitter. Call me bitter because I've had such a bitter experience of life. Machlon and Chilion, very doubtful those were their real names. Nobody would call their children. It's catastrophe and destruction. Then we have the character of Orpah. So Orpah is the daughter-in-law who didn't go with Naomi. And the Midrash tells us because she turned her oref, she turned her back on her mother-in-law. She turned her neck and turned her back on her mother-in-law. And then Ploni Almoni, whose name we don't get. His name actually is Tov, but we don't hear his name at all. And then the idea of Lahokim Shem Hames, to perpetuate the name of the dead. The ancient Romans had a phrase in Latin, nomen est omen, which means your name is an omen, your name is your destiny. And in fact, they believed so much in the strength of names that they would put someone whose name was something like Victor or meant something like victory at the front of the battlefield because they felt that would give them good luck in the battlefields. What's the Jewish idea about names? The Baal Shem Tov tells us that the words neshama, nun, shin, mem, hey, the soul of a person, within it, the middle of the soul of a person is the two letters shem. A person's name is a window to their soul. It's the essence of a person. And that's perhaps why if somebody's unwell, the rabbis would add a name, an extra name, so they would have an additional purpose or additional destiny for them to stay alive beyond their illness. Ruth's name. According to the Midrash, Ruth's name was Gillis, but her name was Ruth in the story because the Midrash tells us Shera'asa b'divrei chamasa, that she heard or she saw, she took a deeper meaning and understood the words of her mother-in-law when her mother-in-law told her, "Leave me, I'll be all right, I'll be all right." The word Ruth is also very similar in Hebrew, Rus, to Reus, which means friendship, and Ruth was the ultimate friend to her mother-in-law, Naomi, and did not desert her. Ruth is the great-grandmother of David, King David, and David will be the ancestor of Moshiach. And we read in Yirmiyahu, "Bayomim hahem uva'es hahi atzmich leDavid semach tzedakah va'osa mishpat u'tzedakah ba'aretz. Bayomim hahem tivasha Yehuda v'Yerushalayim tishgon lavetach." In those days and at that time, I will cause a sprout of righteousness to sprout from David, and he will do justice and charity in the land. In those days, Yehuda will be saved, and Jerusalem will dwell in security. May that happen speedily in our days.